Mm-mm. I like your hat, Babs. I want one of those hats. Oh yeah, I want one. I I could probably order it online.
Or you could just go to DC and check out the museum.
Yeah, I'm going to be down there.
Oh, then you should try to go in.
Oh yeah, I'm going to be down there.
Hey, go.
We're going.
We ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Good morning. Happy
Morning.
Friday. Happy Good Friday. I'm Babz Rawls-Ivy,
And I'm Jeff Grant.
and you're listening to Criminal Justice Insider, sponsored by the Community Foundation of Greater New Haven.
Now more than ever.
So today we have a calling guest. Our guest today is Greg Caruso. And Greg Caruso is professor of philosophy at SUNY Corning and honorary professor of philosophy at Macquarie University. And he's also the visiting researcher and co-director of the Justice Without Retribution Network at the University of Aberdeen School of Law. So before we get to him, Jeff, there's a milestone.
Oh yeah. Oh, first of all, I have to tell you, I did not realize it was Good Friday this morning when I booked the guest, when I booked us. So I pulled up this morning and parked in my usual parking space because you know I'm a creature of habit.
Mm-hmm.
So same parking space, and I go to get my mushroom omelet at Cafe Java across the street, and they're closed.
Yep.
So
And you know, if you park on the street, Jeff, it's free
oh,
because
yeah,
it's the holiday.
today would have been a good time to do that. So of course I'm apoplectic. I don't know what to do. Right? So in my bipolar mind, I'm like freaking out. So I found another place on Grove Street to have breakfast.
Oh, really? Where?
This place called
Zoe's.
Zoe.
Okay.
Oh yeah, it was good.
Yeah. Was it?
It was real good.
I haven't gone in there. They used to be on the other side, like
on Orange. Maybe.
on Orange.
Yeah.
So I haven't gone in there. But that's a good thought.
Oh yeah,
Maybe
the
I'll
owner,
pop over
the
there.
owner introduced himself to me this morning. Lovely guy.
Mm-hmm.
No?
Well, now you got another spot to
We
go
got
to.
another spot. So that's where I'm going to have my 10:30 meeting and my 11:30 meeting this morning at Zoe. So if you're in the hood,
I like that.
yeah.
So congratulations.
I know it's a big thing, isn't it?
Yes.
It's a big thing.
Yes. I saw it on Forbes.com.
It was on Forbes. Yep. This is true. We are in this week's Forbes.com white collar column. This Monday night
Mm-hmm.
is the 150th meeting of our white collar nonviolent support group online.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are incredibly excited about it. 3 years of weekly meetings.
Has it been that long?
3 years. Yep. We started it in May of 2016.
Wow.
And we've had a few people on the call religiously through the whole thing. So we have some 3 years on there, a lot of 2 years, and some new people too. And sometimes people drop off because unfortunately, they got to go away to prison, but they come back. And
that's that reentry life.
so I've been giving a lot of interviews, and there's been a lot of press about it. And people have been reaching out to me, old friends and old colleagues, and the people I haven't heard from in years. And so I'm getting together with them, and some of them will be on the call on Monday night. And we shout out to Walt Pavlo, the columnist for Forbes.com, who does the white collar beat. And he wrote a fantastic article.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone who wants to read it, it's on Forbes.com. You can Google Walt Pavlo probably, and the article will come up.
And if you follow Criminal Justice Insider, it's all over there too.
Oh, yeah. It's all over Criminal Justice Insider, all over prisonist.org.
Yep.
And it's a big deal, because, first of all, most grassroots criminal justice organizations, they don't last 3 meetings, Babs. You know how it is. Everybody's got a different agenda. And this has been about taking responsibility and making amends and living a better life of in support and living in community, coming out of isolation, living in community, and starting to live a respectful, caring, compassionate, responsible life, which unfortunately a lot of us didn't do. And but we're turning a page together and trying for a new kind of respect, and we're hoping that what that does is that leads people to trust us again. That's a big motivation behind this show, and certainly it was a big motivation a couple of years ago in my accepting the executive directorship at Family Reentry, because as a guy who was incarcerated for white collar crime, to become the head of a criminal justice organization was a big deal. And so this is a big deal too on Monday night. So we're hoping anyone who wants to join us, reach out to me at prisonist.org. Jeff Grant at prisonist.org is my email. And I'll send you an invitation and a link. And that's the story.
All right.
Yeah.
And good morning, Lynn Springer and
Andrew Kaplan. We know you're out there. And although Lynn's not listening, Lynn's on her last day today of her yoga retreat out in California.
Oh yeah, I've seen the pictures. I love them.
Yeah,
so.
yeah, she's in social media blackout.
I hear.
I'm in Big Sur.
That's not a bad thing.
No. I'd rather be in Big Sur myself. But
all right, let's bring on our guest, Greg Caruso. Good morning, Greg.
Hi.
How are you? Welcome.
Good.
I tell you what, I want a copy of this book, A Determinist Account of the Illusion of Free Will. I need that book. That sounds. I love the title.
Babz, Greg and I have known each other for a bunch of years now. We've been pen pals and social media pals and traded a lot of stuff. And he kind of freaks me out, to be honest, because he's super, super smart, super worldly, and writes about things that are controversial, I think. Greg, would you say that's true?
Yeah, I think a lot of people would be skeptical of my views on free will. Some people have a hard time with it.
And I might be closer to you than you think. Let's go right at it. Talk about the illusion of free will, because I think you're dead on.
Oh, okay, good. That's good to hear. I mean, it's not a popular view in some quarters. So what I essentially hold is this view called free will skepticism, and essentially it says that who we are, what we do, is ultimately the result of factors beyond our control, and because of that, we're not really morally responsible in this very deep sense called the basic desert sense. And that's what got me, so holding that view is what pulled me into this arena of criminal justice, and then starting to write about alternatives to criminal justice, non-retributive approaches. I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on free will, and if you share this kind of view.
Well, but Greg, is this like an ontological conversation? I mean, are we talking about God here? And
well, no, you don't. Yeah. So my reasons for rejecting free will is that whether some philosophers talk about the threat of determinism, that if everything that occurs is determined to occur by the laws of nature, antecedent conditions, how you were raised, brain chemistry, these are all things that we don't control. You don't control your DNA. You don't control the circumstances into which you were born. You don't control the various, psychological predispositions we come into the world having. There's also matters of luck. Who we are is often a byproduct of luck. The lottery of life isn't always fair. Not everyone is given equal starting points. And, the kind of character we become is often a byproduct of factors, again, we don't control. The kind of deliberation, the kind of persons we become, the kinds of reasons we make our choices for, those feel free. But then the question is, do you ultimately control those? Do you control the various process of deliberation? Do you control the various likes, dislikes, wants, desires, beliefs that you hold at any given moment? My view is that we don't. And because of that, it lends itself to a very deep discussion about what that means for the law, what that means for punishment, what that means for interpersonal relationships, meaning in life. So my views aren't really about God as much as naturalistic concerns having to do with, the nature of reality, laws of nature, brains, consciousness, and social justice issues, which hopefully we can talk a little bit about.
Oh yeah.
Oh, well, I mean, some of this is I find this fascinating only because when you interject race into this,
Yeah.
which is what I like to do often, that it
Yeah.
that you can kind of make the case for saying free will can be an illusion simply because the construct of racism throughout the world is the bigger determinant of what happens to people, whether they succeed or fail, whether they are put in situations or not, whether they get to do things or not do things based on who's in power.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So, I mean, a big part of my view is that the criminal behavior, for example, is a byproduct of, social determinants. And those obviously are going to be affected by the political structure, racism, poverty, socioeconomic inequality, housing and healthcare inequality, educational inequity. We have to start realizing that those are determinant factors in many people's lives and are responsible in many ways for the kind of outcomes we see. And if we want to address criminal justice, we really want to start addressing those social determinants, the kind of things that cause the criminal behavior in the first place. And you can't really talk about criminal justice in the United States without talking about race.
Absolutely, because we already know that by the time Black kids get to third grade, they can already tell how many prison beds are needed by the time that child turns 16 to 18, right? Like that's a determinant. So they already know how to do that. So at any time between that time, actually the school to prison pipeline could be disrupted, but it's not. So that means that says to me that people are that there are forces deliberately creating an atmosphere in which more and more people of color go to prison at exorbitant rates, considering that we are not the majority, but we are the majority in prisons, or disproportionate. So this is where this is all making sense for me.
Yeah, I mean, and the statistics sort of bear this stuff out, right? That white kids don't use drugs any less than Black kids do, but the chances of actually being prosecuted or imprisoned for drug possession is much higher for African Americans. So we know we police certain communities more heavily than others. We know that the laws are inequitable. We know that there are sentencing biases within the system. And so, and we also know the circumstances that are driving crime are often issues that correlate with race pretty well as well, because of historic inequality and the history of America with slavery and lack of opportunity. So if we want to address these bigger, more systemic issues, I think we have to look at it from a much larger perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But Greg, you say that it affects criminal behavior, but isn't the concept of what's criminal itself, a political construct? And you could have people engaged in the same behavior, but we've criminalized it in some geographical areas, or in, say, for example, crack versus other type of drugs.
Yeah, powder
where so what we've done is we've actually compounded the problem, because once someone enters the criminal justice system, then they are more prone to behave criminally. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. I mean, so you could see this, again, in many statutes, that, again, the way the sentencing for crack cocaine versus powder cocaine, for example, well, why has that historically been the case? Well, they're obviously trying to criminalize a certain class of people more than another class. And then it creates a cycle of poverty, incarceration. It devastates whole communities. And, then it drives these other factors. So you remove the breadwinner from the family, you separate individuals, you devastate whole communities. That ultimately is going to, continue the cycle of incarceration, and it's going to make it even harder to get out of those kind of circumstances. So, there's deep historical kind of, I think, racist motivation in trying to police certain communities more heavily than others, and then not just police them in terms of actually sentencing and prosecution. You see that it's much higher in certain communities than others.
So tell me, where do you think people get stuck with this? Because this is not a new concept. Like this goes back to the 7th and 6th century, right? This is a Greek construct. So where do you think, when people see you coming, where do they get stuck in what you're talking about? Because when you lay it out, when we're having this conversation now, it seems quite rational. So where do you think people get twisted about it?
No, because Babz, this isn't the radical part.
This isn't the radical. I take it. Just in America, we have this deep-seated belief in free will. It's kind of built into our DNA. This notion of the rugged individual, the self-made man or the self-made woman, and we have a kind of very deep focus on individual responsibility. So people are antithetical to this kind of. So if you remember back a couple years, Obama gave this really famous speech, and he was talking in front of a successful business crowd, and he said, if you succeeded in business, you didn't do it alone. You didn't build it yourself. You've had help along the way, either by the government or an encouraging teacher or a supportive parent, which when you look at it is a sort of, I think, just factually correct statement. It's a sort of innocuous kind of thought. But the reaction was absolutely crazy, especially on the right. Conservatives were angered by this notion, and if you recall, they ran the whole presidential nomination process on the Republican side that year. The convention to nominate their candidate was around the slogan, "Yes, we did." Like, we built it ourselves. And it sort of struck me. It was kind of your question, like, why that reaction? I mean, the statement, when you look at the full statement and you look at what he said in the next few sentences, just seems true, right? If you've done well in life, you probably had people along the way that helped you, parents that encouraged you, teachers, mentors. But the idea in America, this kind of notion that it's all the individual, is somewhere deep in the psyche. And I also think it actually, this issue is connected obviously to free will, but it's also connected to how we address these bigger social issues.
Absolutely.
Because if you think it's all a matter of individual responsibility, then you're not going to really want to focus or fund initiatives or address policy at what you might think is the root cause, because you think those aren't the causes. It's really about the individual. It's not because,
and when you make poverty a moral failing, right? Like, because that's really the overarching issue. If you're poor because you choose to be poor.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, this is connected. There's work in experimental philosophy and social psychology that shows, for example, that people who believe more strongly in free will also believe more strongly in this belief, what's called the belief in a just world. And essentially, this is just the belief the world is just, good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. Overall, justice is served in some kind of cosmic sense. But the byproduct of that is it turns into a kind of blame the victim approach, because if you've ended up in poverty, well, then somehow you deserved it. Because in a just world, you wouldn't end up in poverty if you didn't deserve it. And it's also, like, we see this in cases of rape. Prosecutors question the impunity of the victim themselves. Well, why do they do that? They do it because it works. And why does it work? Well, it works because people have this deep-seated belief that if the world is just, such a horrific act as rape wouldn't happen to a good person. They must have done something to bring it upon themselves. So I see it as a kind of nefarious kind of belief that stands in the way of real holistic approach.
Greg, I'm from a criminal justice advocate point of view here. What I'm finding fascinating is that in order to get bail or in pardon reform, one of the things you have to show are community contacts. I mean, for pardons, you have to show how you're a part of a community, you're part of a faith community, you're a volunteer, you have a job, you have strong family connections, you've become a member of a community. and for 5 or 10 years you've done that, and you're able to exist within that successfully. So therefore, we will consider you for pardon. But going into sentencing or going into crime, you can't use the argument, well, I couldn't get a job, or I couldn't get a family, or all the criminological factors that are just the opposite of what you need to be able to prove to get a pardon. So, in essence, the burden is unfairly placed.
It is unfairly placed, and then we set them up for failure even after their release, right? Because then how do they reintegrate back into the community? Well, we disenfranchise them by saying they can't apply for public housing.
Exactly.
We say that they can't be full members of the community, so we remove their voting rights. And if we really want to, the goal for me of the criminal justice system should be rehabilitation and reintegration.
Yeah.
And, not only because of my views on free will, but just self-interestedly, you want people to come out better than they went in. But the way our system is currently set up, it actually, sets them up for failure. And we see this. I mean, the recidivism rates are extremely high in the United States. Like 76% of prisoners will be rearrested within the first 5 years of release. And that's because our system is geared toward punitive approaches, punishment, not education, mental health, not drug treatment, not work training, not reintegration, but punitive. And it just doesn't work.
And we absolutely could do all those things, except people are so embedded and wedded to you deserve to be punished, and whatever the harshest punishment we can impose on you, regardless of the crime itself, that's what we want to see happen. And so And so we can't ever get past that. So if you say, we have a captive audience in these prisons across the country. We're going to put in place educational opportunities, trade opportunities, so that when they come out, they won't come back. And people feel like, well, why do they have to go to prison to get that? Like, why couldn't they get that when they were outside of this system and they don't deserve it? So that's a fight that I don't know if we're having yet or if we should be having, but I think that's the crux of why we can't get past doing something more and just with this captured population.
Yeah, I mean, that's what my work is primarily focused on at the moment, is to try to address that punitive, retributive impulse. I mean, there are some absolutely absurd policies. Like in the UK, for example, they passed this ban the book in prison.
Yeah.
It basically prohibited people. The only instinct for that is retributive or punitive. Like they don't even deserve the luxuries of books. Luckily, the High Court struck it down because they thought, well, books seem really important for rehabilitation. But the best way, sometimes I think going at it from my views on free will might push people away a little bit. But on the other hand, you could just go at it in terms of their own self-interest. That don't you think we want people to come out? We want to preserve, safety in communities. We want to make individuals come back and be contributing members. And I think the more and more people realize how big the criminal justice system is and how many people are touched by it, they start to realize that punitive approaches are just not working. 1 in 31 Americans is somewhere within the criminal justice system. That's just absurd. I mean, some prison, parole, probation, federal, jail. That's a huge number of Americans. So I think there is some bipartisan movement toward reform, but I'm also skeptical that it's really addressing the core, the core kind of driver of mass incarceration, which I think is this, as you put it, like this punitive impulse, this desire for punishment.
Yeah, but Greg, generally, this is a conversation that any progressive, liberal, criminal justice reform advocate, we all agree on this. But you've really taken this to a place where it is quite radical, and people and your opponents probably accuse you of failing to put responsibility in the hands of people who have done some outrageous acts.
Right. Yeah, so what I would say is that, we have to get clear on what we mean by responsibility. I mean, there are certain notions of responsibility that I'm okay with, that I think are consistent with the denial of free will. So, like, you could be causally responsible, i.e., you were the one who pulled the trigger, or you were the one who defrauded somebody out of their savings. That's okay. And we could even take a kind of what I would call attributability responsibility, like you could attribute to me various personality traits, various flaws in my character, various virtues. Even if you recognize they're not self-made, or that they're the byproduct of factors I didn't control. What I'm denying is a kind of what I call basic desert moral responsibility, that you justly deserve to be praised or blamed, punished, and rewarded in this what I call basic desert sense, which means essentially you deserve that punishment even if it had no forward-looking benefit. So, for example, there's this famous philosopher, Immanuel Kant, who was a retributivist, but he also believed in the death penalty. And he gives this example where he says, if there was some desert island and this society was going to disband and scatter around the globe, and there was one remaining prisoner left in prison, a murderer, that you would be obligated, not only justified, but obligated to execute that person before you left the island. And his reasoning was purely backward-looking, because it's not to deter crime moving forward. There's no one left to deter. Mm-hmm. It's not for the future moral formation of this individual because he's going to be killed. It's not to set a signal to deter others because there's no one around left. Mm-hmm. It has no forward-looking benefit. So the pure justification is that they deserve it in this very basic sense. And that's the kind of responsibility I'm denying. That doesn't mean we can't engage in restorative justice processes. We can't sit parties down and try to figure out the best way to move forward. We can't recognize flaws in ourselves and then try to work toward improving them. I agree with those kind of notions. I disagree with the kind of eternal damnation or eternal reward notion, or the notion that this individual deserves to be punished even if it had no forward-looking benefit.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, so do you get the pushback from the religious community, because this seems to run smack up against faith-based kinds of things?
Occasionally, I mean, you get this. I mean, I'll say that the faith-based community is diverse. So, there are, say, sects of Christianity that give up the belief in free will, like Calvinists, for example. And there may be other Eastern traditions, like Buddhism, that might be more consistent with my view. But yeah, the traditional Christian notion of eternal punishment, for example, or eternal reward, does seem grounded very heavily in this belief in free will. But I have problems with that notion, because, like, just imagine, things were set up from the beginning of time in such a way that an agent was determined to, say, steal a car on their 21st birthday. And let's say in another universe, the person was determined from the beginning of time to give money to a charity on their 21st birthday. And they both do it. And they could not have done otherwise, given all the circumstances, the way the universe was organized, their past experiences, their upbringing. I find it really hard to say in that circumstance that we should justify, some eternal punishment or eternal reward for those acts if they were ultimately the result of factors they didn't control. But I don't know what's your intuition on it.
I mean, I actually think this probably is much more suited to the faith-based community, in the sense that it is the question of we don't know, and sometimes that's not the mysteries of the universe, and the mystery of God is a big deal, and I think this could fit right in with that thinking if you allow yourself to remove the barriers to if you give up thinking about karma, and if you give up thinking about
right.
You know what I mean? Like, if you give up thinking about karma, then you don't have that you don't have that predetermined, well, you get what you get based on what you put into the universe, right? Because that's that new age kind of thinking these days. And that's a lot of that prosperity gospel stuff.
Right. Yeah, that's the part I think that's interesting. But I also think, like you suggest, if you focus on the compassionate components of these
Right.
religious traditions, faith-based traditions, I think there's a whole lot of rich text and support for the idea that we have to do more to help those in poverty, right?
Mm-hmm.
That a Christian should be for providing equal health care to everybody, providing and trying to address certain social, and there's a rich history of social activism, right, in these faith-based traditions of addressing social justice. And so those parts, I think, are absolutely in line with this idea. What gets in the way, I think, is that sort of intuition and that kind of reaction to that, Obama-like statement, right? That people see that on the one hand, and then they resist it and put it all in the hands of personal responsibility on the other. That the individual in poverty is in poverty because somehow it's their own moral failure.
Mm-hmm.
Not looking at the social injustice that might have caused the circumstances.
Yeah.
And if you succeeded, it's all you, right? You deserve all the praise. It's not that part, I think, would have to be resisted. But I do think there's a rich, history of social justice movements within faith-based organizations that would be perfectly in line with what I'm proposing.
I think you're right.
Greg, but how is this different than the arguments at the end of the 19th century, a Rauschenbusch kind of argument where the church moved away from concepts of personal salvation into the social gospel? And so the social construct became probably more important, at least probably until the end of World War I. So what's important here? I mean, in terms, what do you see as a solution? And is that turning towards all of these social injustices and making life different so that we can disrupt the intergenerational cycle of criminal justice or of poverty, or
so I mean, obviously you have to have some account of what to do with someone who ends up at the tail end of a system, and let's say they're a serial killer or a real threat to society. But my real focus is on prevention and social justice. So my model is really a model. I call it the public health quarantine model because I take a public health approach to dealing with criminal behavior. And in that sense, just like real public health institutions, think of like the CDC, the EPA, the Consumer Protection Agency. These are primarily preventative institutions. The CDC's main goal is to prevent pandemics, outbreaks of disease. They would only use quarantine, for example, after they failed in their primary mission statement, right? So I would argue if we take a public health approach to criminal behavior, what we need to look at are what are the social determinants of health, just like what's the social determinants of criminal behavior, just like what are the social determinants of poor health, and then target those. And I've tried to identify a number: poverty, socioeconomic status, abuse, exposure to violence, lack of access to housing and health care, mental health issues, education, even nutrition and environmental health. So we know, for example, that nearly 90% of women in prison are victims of abuse, child abuse, domestic abuse, rape, sexual assault. So we know there's this correlation between being themselves exposed to violence and then either retaliating against their abuser or committing a criminal act at the behest or all these often co-occur with drug addiction too. So we need to prevent the kind of exposure to violence. We need to address the root causes. We know poverty is driving not just poor health outcomes, but also incarceration rates. So we need to effectively address those social determinants. So you can't address criminal justice, in my view, without simultaneously addressing social justice.
Absolutely. And Skip Gates right now is doing this whole the Reconstruction series on PBS at the moment, which I think is bumps up right against Ava DuVernay's The 13th. And you really, when you see this, when you understand the history of this country and racism, you really understand the extension of slavery into the criminal justice arena. I mean, it just is. And so to try to refute that and not to undo that, any conversation that you have that does not talk about racism in the criminal justice system is a conversation that is really a waste of time, because this system is designed to sort of do one thing, and that is to mass incarcerate a group of people for a long period of time that falls in line with what was happening at the turn of from Reconstruction. So that's
Yeah.
my take on it.
I mean, I'll add to that even moving forward. Like, so there does seem this bipartisan kind of agreement that we need to address mass incarceration and reform the criminal justice system. But there's an interesting question: why all of a sudden does there seem to be this bipartisan agreement? And there's a work by this legal scholar at Cornell, Joseph Margulies, who's suggested that race might be at the bottom of even the current criminal justice reform movement. And it goes something like this: in the past, the drug epidemics were primarily crack cocaine and various drugs in the 1980s and 90s that affected inner city minorities. And there didn't seem to be any real drastic movement towards wanting to reform criminal justice or prevent mass incarceration. But all of a sudden, the drug epidemics have now moved to opiates and prescription painkillers, and these are much more effective rural, white, poor communities. So people are being drawn into the criminal justice system that, in their view, right, shouldn't be, people in the criminal justice system. So, like Rush Limbaugh was addicted to, prescription painkillers and was convicted for, false prescriptions. And we have people like Chris Christie, who last time around, gave this impassioned speech for criminal justice reform, and he told this story about his law school buddy who got addicted to opiates and lost everything: his wife, his house, his career, his legal degree. And this was a call for criminal justice reform. But you got to realize that those are because these are people who are being affected now by the criminal justice system who may not have been affected in the past. So my fear is if that's the root movement, the motivation for criminal justice reform, we might not be going far enough. We might just carve out that reform so as to, affect the people who, to help the people that we think shouldn't be incarcerated, but still come down really tough on all of these other people who we think, maybe should be incarcerated. And that's not going to be real reform in my view.
Right.
So it's not really what's worse for blacks. It's really what's best for whites. And whether that motivation be not becoming incarcerated or money, which shockingly probably is at the root of everything, right? Slavery and Reconstruction, everything else. It's all about the money. So what's your plan to move this forward?
Well, I mean, so I have this network that I work with. It's called the Justice Without Retribution Network. And we're trying to look at alternative models to retribution, bringing scholars together, philosophers, lawyers, judges, people from disciplines as diverse as neuroscience and criminal psychology, to try to look for ethical approaches that could deal successfully with, the needs of the criminal justice system, but provide alternatives to this approach. And I've written from everything about free will to even how we design prisons. I mean, our prisons are essentially designed for punitive purposes. But when you compare them to say, prisons in Norway or Denmark or Sweden, that the primary goal in those countries has already been adopted. Their policies are focused on rehabilitation and reintegration. And their prisons are literally designed for those purposes. So like Halden Prison, for example, in Norway has, 75 acres of trees. Well, our prisons are devoid of all trees and vegetation for sight lines. And so to minimize, to provide oversight. They spread out the living facilities. They give prisoners maximum autonomy because they want to encourage interaction between the prisoners and the guards, because they realize that the conditions to which they're going to return have to resemble the conditions in which they're being held, because otherwise you learn a kind of learned helplessness. in our prisons. We isolate prisoners from the minute they get there. We strip them naked. We dehumanize them. We minimize their interactions, and we deprive them of any opportunity to better themselves. And then we release them and expect them to be model citizens. Well, that's not going to work. So when you have a system that's already designed and focused on punishment and punitiveness, and then we wonder why we have the highest incarceration rate in the world, why we have one of the highest recidivism rates in the world. It shouldn't be a surprise.
And our new commissioner, Roland Cook, had that same thought about the concept of the way the prisons are designed, and because he had went over to those very countries and took a look at how they do it, and he, on this show, he said, that makes a huge difference. The construct of an actual prison goes a long way in what happens to people when they're incarcerated and what happens to them when they get out. And that the design of the prison ought to be part of the conversation of trying to sort of do incarceration differently in this country.
Greg,
absolutely. I mean, I just say Norway actually has a principle that's part of their system. It's called the principle of normality, which stipulates that the conditions in prison should resemble as much as possible the conditions outside prison, because the expectation is everyone's going back. They have no such thing as life imprisonment, actually. They have max sentence you could get in Norway is 21 years for any crime. And they could actually add some increments if they feel that someone is not rehabilitated or is a continued threat. But generally, the expectation is that people are going back. And the average sentence is actually less than a year for incarceration. And so they actually want the conditions to resemble the kind of conditions that you're going to go back to, because that's the best way to reintegrate more seamlessly back into the community. Whereas we deprive people completely of their autonomy, their ability to dictate their own choices, even personalize their own spaces. We control every aspect of their day. And then we just release them with no support, no social safety net, no, oversight, no attempt to place them in jobs or training, and we expect them to be model citizens, and it just doesn't work that way.
Greg, we have a unit here in our prisons, in the male prison. It's called the True Unit. It's called the Worth Unit in the women's prison, and it's adopted a lot of these of the model from Germany and from Norway. And Roland Cook, the Commissioner of Corrections, has been on our show, so of course Babz and I are best friends with him now. So we're gonna contact them and see if you can come down and tour the units and get some vision of what we're doing here in Connecticut, and maybe you can add to the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Because my view is that if individuals don't, deserve this kind of punitive punishment, this retributive, backward-looking punishment in this kind of deep sense, we might be justified in incapacitating someone, for the safety of society, but they should preserve all their human rights. We should not take away their human dignity. We should not dehumanize them, and the goal should be, again, to rehabilitate and reintegrate. So this analogy, some people don't like this analogy, but this analogy with quarantine is something like this. Like if I were to get on a plane and go overseas and I contracted Ebola, well, I didn't do anything morally wrong. This is not a byproduct of free will. I don't deserve punishment or retribution. But I think almost all of us would agree we're justified in quarantining that individual for the safety of society. But if we do that, we're not justified in treating them cruelly. You have a moral duty to treat that individual and then release them the minute they're no longer a threat to society. You're not justified in holding them a minute longer, right? And so this would require massive reform of the criminal justice system, because things like solitary confinement or isolation would not be justified on my view. Neither would dehumanizing conditions that most of our prisons exhibit, the kind of harsher forms of punishment. and these punitive designs. None of that could be justified on my model. In my view, actually, you shouldn't lose any other right than your liberty in this particular circuit. You should retain the right to vote. In my view, you should retain the right to vote even while in prison, let alone after release.
Mm-hmm. I think that's and I I'm starting to hear those kinds of rumblings in certain circles around that very concept that that people ought to be able to vote, because listen, these prisons are in communities. I mean, these prisons are shoring up people's tax dollars, right? These prisoners are being counted in places where they don't live for the tax dollars. So why can't they vote? Why can't they have a say in I don't think you ought to lose your right that way. And the minute that you're free, you should be reinstated fully. And I think people are starting to understand that.
Yeah, this stuff goes back to the medieval period. There were policies in medieval Europe called civil death, that when you committed a criminal act, you were declared civilly dead, which meant you lost all your rights, your property rights, inheritance rights, and even you were like outside the law. If someone murdered you, they couldn't be prosecuted or charged because you were not even seen as a member of society. Most of those policies have fallen by the wayside, but we hold on to them with this voter disenfranchisement and other things, where we take the worst moment of someone's life and we make it the defining moment of who they are. And we say that there's no chance of second chances. There's no opportunity to become a full member of society again. This is just, in my view, going back to racism, there's, other motivations for this. When you look at the fact that in the last election, 6.1 million Americans couldn't vote. And a huge percentage of those were African American. And I don't know, I mean, it's 1 in 13 African Americans in this country have permanently lost their voting rights. 1 in 13. I don't think that's by chance. I think it's by design.
Oh, it is by design. I would argue that point anywhere in the world, that it is exactly by design. Well, particularly when you look at the war on drugs and how it decimated whole communities. People went to jail for years and years and years on marijuana charges, right? Like,
well, look, down in Florida, they've just given felons the right to vote. So there's over 1 million people going to come onto the voters' rolls, and Florida's not going to be a hanging Chad state anymore.
Well, but the other part of that is the disenfranchised. Even giving people the right to vote is up against moving places where people can go vote. See, therein lies the problem. So you can give people their rights back to vote, but when you remove the places where people can go vote, that's continued disenfranchisement. That's what they are having. That's what they've been doing.
Yeah. I mean, but from what I've heard, the legislators in Florida, or even some of them, are trying to push back, even though it was a referendum.
Shocking. We're shocked, Greg.
I was like, okay, y'all voted for this. Y'all did this.
No, it was a referendum.
So I mean, but they'll find other ways to sort of be, to disenfranchise, and one of the ways to do it is to move voting places out of people's communities, so and then make less and less places where people can vote, so that the lines are long, so that it is far away and it's hard to get to, right? So that's another way to sort of disenfranchise.
Look what happened in Georgia. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. So tell me.
And let me add, I mean, this stuff is, like sometimes the view that I've, put forth, people worry about victims' rights, and are we giving too much over to the individual who committed the act and not considering the victims? But there's this huge study that came out from the Alliance for Safety and Justice. I think it was 2016. That polled and surveyed over 800 victims of violent acts, and it seems that they want things very much in line with what I'm suggesting. So, like, by 2-to-1 margin, victims preferred criminal justice. The criminal justice system focused more on rehabilitation. By 15-to-1, victims preferred increased investment in schools and education. And the same with 7-to-1, they think there should be more investment in mental health treatment and less investment in prisons and jails. They actually overwhelmingly think 6 in 10 victims think that going to jail actually makes the person more likely to commit crime than less likely to commit crime.
Mm-hmm.
And overwhelmingly, they're asking, it seems the victims want the prosecutors to listen to them. But we've gotten so wrapped up in this tough on crime mentality that sometimes prosecutors claim they're acting on behalf of victims, that victims want retribution and payback. But they're not actually even listening to what the victims want. It seems that what the victims want most is that someone else doesn't go through what they went through. And they're realizing that the best way to do that is both to invest in preventative measures and to invest in rehabilitation. So actually, when you look at what victims want, it isn't what these tough on crime advocates suggest.
I think you're right.
Yep.
This has been a wonderful conversation, Greg Caruso. I'm going to read your books because this is fascinating stuff to me.
And watch the TED Talk. It's fascinating.
I'm going to catch that too. So that might be my weekend jam is to be all about Greg Caruso. Thank you for your time. And if y'all want to know more about Greg Caruso, you can go to he has a website, www.gregcaruso.com. You can go there and get all the information that you need on Greg Caruso. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. I appreciate the conversation.
Greg, great talking to you this morning.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, wonderful.
Thank you. I hope you come back.
Yeah. Well, we're going to have him down in Connecticut soon. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. All right, Jeff Grant, we're out of here. Thank you to Lynn Springer.
And to Andrew Kaplan. Love you, Babz.
Love you.
Another great show.
Thank you, Community Foundation for Greater New Haven.
Now more than ever.
And good luck on Monday night for the celebration.
Yep,
the 150th.
150th meeting of our White Collar Nonviolent Support Group.
Yay.
And if you want information, it's on prisonist.org.
Okay. Thank you, Harry Droz.
Thank you, Harry.
All right.